In this video, we talk a little bit more about the case of HM, or Henry Mollison, and his amnesia, his memory issues, and how they relate to the hippocampus specifically. So, for HM, Henry Mollison, when he was young, he had epilepsy. So he was having seizure activity that researchers, doctors, identified were coming from the medial temporal lobes, the middle part of his temporal lobes on the side. This is where the hippocampus lies. The hippocampus is just on the top of the medial temporal lobe. To treat this epilepsy, doctors performed a somewhat extreme surgery, but this was experimental treatment at the time. Was they were finding that they could remove parts of the brain without causing someone to die, right? And without always having severe consequences. And so, for people with epilepsy, knowing that there's uncontrolled brain activity, doctors reasoned that they could remove the parts that were responsible for that epilepsy, for those seizures, and that would treat the condition. So they did bilateral medial temporal lobectomy, which means bilateral, both sides, medial temporal lobe lobectomy. They just removed the middle parts of his temporal lobes on both sides. And there was a report that Dr. William Scoville put out on his treatment and then a bunch of other people's treatments, removing either one side or both sides in this type of epilepsy. And the result was that it worked. So the seizures reduced greatly, and HM was able to survive and continue on without the seizure activity greatly affecting his life anymore. However, he demonstrated severe anterograde amnesia. And this is where we get to different types of amnesia. You may be aware that amnesia is inability to remember, but there's two types. Okay, anterograde amnesia is an inability to form new memories. This is different from retrograde amnesia, which oftentimes we think about when we think about amnesia. Well, if I can't remember, then I can't remember my past, right? So I can't remember yesterday, or I can't remember my childhood, or I can't remember who I are, right? That's usually not the case. I usually can remember who I are, right? So that's retrograde amnesia. That's the past. Anterograde amnesia is the future. So in anterograde amnesia, you have difficulty learning new things, forming new memories. So if you meet somebody new and they tell you their name, you might never remember that person's name, no matter how many times they tell you, no matter how well you get to know them, or what sort of impact they make on you, you might not ever remember that person's name. And that was HM's issues. This was discovered, this anterograde amnesia, was discovered by Brenda Milner. So Scoville did the surgery, and then Dr. Brenda Milner went in as a neuropsychologist to do a bunch of memory testing, psychological testing, to see what sorts of consequences the surgery had psychologically. And what she found was that he had limited retrograde amnesia. This was for a brief period prior to the surgery. And this is common oftentimes when you go under anesthetics or anesthesiology, or when you experience trauma, right? Physical trauma to the brain, you get a little bit of retrograde amnesia. But he didn't have issues remembering his childhood, though, right? Where the issues were profound were in anterograde amnesia, which we described as the inability to form new memories. Probably due to the extent of his surgery, he had nearly his entire medial temporal lobe removed. Other patients had maybe just one side as opposed to bilateral, or just parts removed. He had his entire hippocampus basically removed, parts of his amygdala removed, medial temporal lobe removed, that sort of thing. What's really interesting about his case, because you probably heard that hippocampus does memory, is that not all memories were affected, right? First, his childhood memories were not affected, so the hippocampus doesn't seem to store childhood memories, right? But there were a bunch of other things too that were spared. And it's really the spared memories that are interesting about HM. because this tells us which parts of memory, which types of memory are not involving the hippocampus or the medial temporal lobe, right? So first of all, HM didn't have any issues with general cognitive ability. So there's a difference between um, the ability to form new memories and the ability to think, right? Um, so not being able to learn new things is going to be a problem, right? But it's not necessarily going to affect my general ability to think and process information in the moment. So his short-term memory um, was similar to other people. And in fact, his IQ test scores, they gave him IQ test scores before the surgery and after, were the same. He didn't reduce in his IQ test. They went up even just like a couple points. So his ability to like process information, do cognitive things, wasn't harmed. He just couldn't remember doing those things. Okay. Real quick aside on short-term memory, right? So because HM was able to do short-term memory just fine, let's talk about what that is, right? So short-term memory, or in more modern terms, we'll use the term working memory, because it's not just sitting there for a short time, we're actually working on it, is the idea. Working memory lasts about 15 to 30 seconds if you don't keep thinking about it. Okay. Short-term memory is not hours or days, right? So if you forgot something from yesterday, that's not an issue with short-term memory. Um, this would be somebody told you something 15 seconds ago, and you moved on in your head, and you've lost track of the conversation, right? So you were paying attention here, and then you're no longer paying attention, 30 seconds later, and you're not tracking the conversation, right? Or again, you go to the kitchen to get something, you have that in your mind, you get into the kitchen and you're distracted, and you can no longer remember what it was that you were planning to do. That's short-term or working memory. Keep in mind that we all have short-term memory. So unless you like don't have a frontal lobe functioning, we all have a short-term memory. So it's not accurate to say that, oh, my memory is bad, that means I have a short-term memory. People will say that colloquially. Um, Short-term memory is a type of memory. It's not a duration where some of us have a short-term and some of us have long-term. Short-term memory, or working memory, which is part of the reason we like this term better, is the thing that we all do to some extent or more as we're processing information in the moment. So we'll use this term working memory where we're actively maintaining and controlling attention, and maintaining ideas for the last 15 to 30 seconds as we're processing them. Okay? This seems to rely on the prefrontal cortex, or the very front of your frontal lobe, the most anterior part of your brain. And that was spared in HM, except for just a little damage from the surgery. His prefrontal cortex was intact, which makes sense why he was able to do these kinds of things, right? So he could maintain the task, he could maintain a conversation, he could go to the kitchen and remember what he's planning to do for 15 to 30 seconds or so, and then it's just the things beyond that that he can't remember anymore. And this working memory ability seems to be related to other complex processing, right? Like making a decision, long-term planning, IQ tests, those kinds of things are much easier to do if you have a functioning working memory, if your working memory capacity is strong. So this is different from long-term memory, right? Where HM's issues were particularly in terms of explicit memories, new explicit memories. Right? Explicit memories are ones that you can declare out loud or explicitly. And this includes two types that we've already talked about: episodic memories, or events, and semantic memories, like facts or knowledge. Right? So as people age, they tend to just naturally have difficulty with explicit memories, particularly episodic memories, so not remembering um, events, and maintain semantic memories, or the ability to form new semantic memories. In fact, people gain knowledge over time, right? So your semantic memory increases um, over time. And as we get older, our memories for events from our childhood get more semantic over time. So I remember that I went to Disney World as a kid, but I don't remember all of the events of going to Disney World as a kid. Okay, so that's natural kind of aging and loss. For HM, he lost both, right? So he had difficulty learning new facts, he had difficulty remembering new events. So these are explicit memories of both kinds that HM had an issue with. So if we talk about explicit memories, the opposite of explicit memories are implicit memories. And what was really interesting was that implicit memories were spared in HM. So if explicit memories are ones that I can say out loud, like I remember going to the store, I remember that George Washington was the first president, then implicit memories are ones that you can't say out loud, right? So they affect my behavior going ahead, but they're not explicit. Sometimes we might refer to these as unconscious memories. Some examples of this are conditioning, right? So if I learn that when my alarm goes off, it's time to wake up, or uh, when my cat learns, right, that when the cabinet opens, it's food time. The cat can't say that out loud, but the cat certainly remembers it implicitly. Oh, door open, I'm going to get excited, right? Procedural memories like skills, like being able to ride a bike, you can't necessarily say out loud how to ride a bike, or it's really difficult, but you do remember them. And then pattern recognition. So we just notice patterns out in the world that we don't necessarily know that we're noticing them, but we know, right, that, oh, when the sky looks like this, the rain's coming, right? Just because we notice the patterns over time, right? We know that when objects get bigger, that they're probably getting closer, right? Um, we learn that as babies. Those are patterns. All of these types of memory seem to be involved in activity beyond the hippocampus. Okay, maybe the thalamus, the cerebellum, basal ganglia. We'll come back to this in the next video. Okay, but the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe don't seem to be involved in this kind of memory really much at all. And in HM, consistent with this, his implicit memories were intact. He could be conditioned, he could learn new patterns, and he could learn new skills. So in conditioning, the demonstration of this is a puff of air in your face, right? So when a light shines and then an air puff comes, most people are going to learn to condition to relate those stimuli, right? So that light now signals puff of air is coming. So when the light signals, you and I are going to flinch, right? And we would be able to explicitly say why we flinched, right? Oh, I flinched because I know that that the air means puff of air. Sorry, light means puff of air. For HM, he could learn implicitly that the light means puff of air. You shine the light, puff of air, shine the light, puff of air, shine the light, puff of air. And then the next time you shine the light, you would flinch. But you would ask him why he flinched, and he wouldn't know. Okay? So he could be conditioned. That's implicit memory. That part of the brain that was removed in him doesn't seem involved in that at all then. Let's talk about the next two. As a demonstration of skill learning, implicit skill learning, um, uh, Brenda Milner gave HM a mirror tracing task. And in this task, she had HM trace an object like this star, but in a mirror, right? So everything's backwards. And it's a difficult task. So the first time you try it, the first time you day you try it, you're going to make a lot of errors. You're going to go outside the lines because it's in a mirror, it's backwards, right? And you're going to get better as you practice. Well, you and I would practice on day one and get better. And then on day two, we're still going to be, maybe we got to practice a little bit, right? But we're going to make we're going to make more progress. And over time, eventually, we're just going to be expert mirror tracers, right? Because we have memory, we have skills. This is data from HM. So on day two, on day three, he was making no errors at all. He was becoming basically an expert mirror tracer. But you would ask HM, hey, have you ever done this before? And he would say, no, never done this before in my life. I have no idea why I'm so good at it. It's the first time I've ever tried. It's day 3, right? First time I've ever tried this. I have no memory of doing it explicitly, but I can do it perfectly. So whatever is going on in skill learning doesn't seem to be requiring the hippocampus or the medial temporal lobes because HM could do it. Last demonstration from HM is the incomplete pictures test, and this is pattern recognition, right? So in the incomplete pictures test, you get a picture like this, and you try to guess what it is. Take a second to guess what this is, and you make an error because you don't know what it is, right? It gets a little bit easier. We fill in some of the blanks, and you might be able to make a guess. It gets a little bit clearer, and you can probably guess what they are now, right? Gets even clearer, and you can obviously see that it's an elephant and an umbrella. So on set 1, most people make errors, right? On set 2, it gets a little easier. On set 3, 4, and 5, eventually, you're going to be able to guess what all these things are. Well, if I were to give you this test again, right, and I gave you this picture, there's a good chance you're going to remember that this is an elephant and that this is an umbrella, right? You remember it explicitly. Well, HM also could remember that. So he got this right on the next try. He didn't know why he knows that this is an elephant, right? But an hour later, he made a lot fewer mistakes than he did the first time, right? He remembers the pattern implicitly. So that kind of recognition, that pattern recognition, doesn't seem to involve the hippocampus very much. So breaking this all down, HM is just one case, but it showed us some things about memory that apply generally and that we've confirmed with future research. So first of all, the medial temporal lobes, the middle part of your temporal lobes, are very important for memory, including the hippocampus. So we've identified at least one part of the brain that's critical for memories, and that's the hippocampus and the surrounding medial temporal lobes. It also demonstrated this idea that there's different stages of memory, right? That short-term and long-term memory are different. They require different parts of your brain, right? And that storage is different than encoding, right? So HM had stored memories from his childhood and he had no problem, right? Getting them back out. But it was encoding new memories. Learning new memories was the problem, right? So the hippocampus seems to be involved in long-term memory, but not short-term memory, and learning new memories, not necessarily storing them forever, right? So we've got some separations here. And then finally, there's different types of memory, right? So HM could learn new implicit memories, but not explicit memories, right? So the hippocampus is involved in memory, but specifically long-term encoding of explicit memories, right? So memory gets complicated, and the parts of the brain that are involved in each type of memory or stage of memory are going to be different. And I mentioned that future research kind of confirmed what we learned from HM, and part of that was just confirming which part of the medial temporal lobe was really involved, because he had basically all of the middle part of his temporal lobe, his amygdala, and his hippocampus removed. In future cases and in research with animals and in MRI research, we've really discovered that it's the hippocampus specifically. Okay, and sometimes even certain areas of the hippocampus can be isolated that seem to be responsible for this kind of global amnesia, inability to form new memories, anterograde amnesia. So the hippocampus specifically seems to be really important for this kind of memory. And finally, we've discovered that once we've isolated the hippocampus is really important, let's try to figure out what the hippocampus is really involved in terms of memory. And it helps us with new explicit memories, but it also is really critical for what's known as spatial memory, the ability to remember maps, or in rats, the ability to remember places in a maze. This was demonstrated with a number of interesting examples, right? So in humans, um, London cab drivers go through a long period of testing and training to memorize the map of London, which is a mess. It's not a grid pattern. It's developed by people with horses and buggies, right? So remembering every cross street in London and the best way to get from here to there in London is really difficult. So researchers studied London cab drivers before they went through the training and after they went through the training. And what they found was that the hippocampus changed size. So once somebody had gone through all this training of the map of London, and now they've got a perfect map of London, their hippocampus was actually enlarged compared to before they went through the training. Okay? So the hippocampus may be particularly attuned to um, spatial memory. We also see this in birds. So some birds cache their food. They need to remember where they buried their food or where they put food in trees. And the birds that do that have bigger hippocampus and better hippocampal activity than birds that don't have to remember those kinds of spaces. We can also demonstrate this in rats, right? So you put a rat in a radial arm maze, it needs to remember where the food is. If you damage the rat's hippocampus specifically, not like Lashley, just like cutting parts of the brain out. If you go directly for the hippocampus and certain areas of the hippocampus, even what you find is that this task becomes more difficult. If you damage other parts of the brain, then the task doesn't become more difficult for the rat. So the hippocampus seems to be involved in forming new explicit memories and in spatial memory specifically. Okay, so think back to your intro to psych class where you learned that the hippocampus is your memory center. And now think about, okay, the hippocampus is a specific type of memory center for specific types of memories. In the next video, we'll talk about all the other parts of the brain that are involved.